Did Connecticut state troopers unwittingly record themselves fabricating charges against a protester? That's what a new lawsuit filed by the ACLU of Connecticut claims. On September 11, 2015, Connecticut resident Michael Pickard was reportedly peacefully protesting at a traffic checkpoint in West Hartford when State Trooper John Barone walked over to Pickard and slapped Pickard's camera out of his hand. Barone then confiscated Pickard's legally carried pistol and pistol permit. When Pickard picked up his camera and resumed filming, Barone erroneously claimed that filming the police is illegal. He proceeded to confiscate Pickard's camera and take it back to his police cruiser, placing it on the car's roof. What the troopers didn't realize was that the camera was still working and recording their full conversation. In the recording, Barone can be heard discussing with Sergeant John Jacoby how to justify charging Pickard, saying at one point, quote, "Gotta cover our ass." Listen closely.
He was on the highway portion? Yeah. We have a record to the highway by a pedestrian and including a public disturbance.
With the camera still rolling, the officers proceed to call a Hartford police officer to see if there was any grudges against Pickard, open an investigation of Pickard in the police database, and discuss a separate protest that he had organized at the state capitol. The police eventually charged Pickard with reckless use of highway by a pedestrian and creating a public disturbance. Both charges are eventually dropped by the state after nearly a year in the Connecticut Superior Court system. Now the ACLU of Connecticut is representing Pickard in a lawsuit against 3 of the state police troopers involved in the incident: John Barone, Patrick Tornio, and John Jacoby. For more, we go to Hartford, where we're joined by Dan Barrett, who's the legal director of the ACLU of Connecticut. Dan Barrett, welcome to Democracy Now! You know, it's really hard to hear the video that they unwittingly had on as they were scheming. Can you say what it said and what you're calling for?
Sure. A lot of the video, as you say, is somewhat difficult to hear, but there are many points in the video in which it's quite clear what's going on. And as you say, after Michael's camera was confiscated, the state troopers appear to have a discussion in which they go over Michael's past protests, even though Michael had never met any of the 3 troopers there. And then they talk about which charges they could apply to Michael. So the salient points, to my untrained ears, are there in the video, in that we have a discussion about what appears to be retaliating against the protester for his activities.
And could you explain, Dan Barrett, what rights do protesters have to film or photograph police officers?
Sure. As long as the person doing the filming is not interfering with the police officers, there's no prohibition, certainly in Connecticut, against recording the police officers doing their work in public. And that's true, by the way, of any government employee. So for me, the ridiculousness of the situation that Michael faced is that if he had been recording, a road crew or a fire department putting out a fire, it would be laughable for one of those government employees to come up and take away his camera. But generally speaking, to answer your question, if a person is not directly interfering with the government employee who's doing their job, then they're free to record what's going on a public street.
So you have the police officer telling Pickard, taking my picture is illegal. And then you have the recording capturing the troopers saying, at what point we really got to cover our asses.
That's right. And so the combination of those things is pretty galling, especially here in Connecticut, where we recently, our legislature passed a state law, in fact, that makes clear that people can record the police doing their jobs. So we have, no prohibition against it. Not only that, we have our state legislature saying quite clearly that it's permissible and that any police officer who gets in the way of a recording can be sued. And then we have a discussion about what might be done to a protester who's exercising his rights both to protest and to record.
So what do you think should happen to those police officers? Should they be criminally charged?
Well, I'm not sure about criminal charges, but I think that there's a number of things that have to happen, all of which fall under the category of correction. And this is something that the reason that this case is so important is not just for the right to record and the right to protest for everyone in Connecticut, but also because we're at, a moment in our history, or maybe I should say, another sad moment in our history when we're trying to get control over the police, and we're trying to get police departments across the country to understand that They need to behave in a different way than business as usual. And so I think generally speaking, what would be nice to happen to the state troopers involved here is a correction to their behavior. So some meaningful intervention which would correct their behavior and teach them that what they did was wrong and that it should never happen again.
How unusual,
and an intervention,
how unusual
Sorry,
is it for police to fabricate charges?
Well, I can't really say empirically. I'm sure there are people who have some pretty strong opinions about that. It's really hard for me to tell. But in this case, it certainly seems from the evidence that what was going on is a discussion about, what might be said and what might be put into the record to support charges.
And
so
how
it's
your
very
client,
disturbing.
Michael Picard, I'm just going fast because we have just a few seconds, how this affected his life. He's been dealing with this now for a year in court, these charges against him.
Sure. Having criminal charges hanging over one's head is never a fun period. I mean, he was for a year worried about what was going to happen to him. And not only that, worried about what was going to happen as the charges are hanging over. How does that affect his protest activity? He was worried about protesting. Would he make things worse for himself in the criminal case? So it was very gut-wrenching for Michael.
Dan Barrett, I want to thank you for being with us, head of the ACLU of Connecticut, the legal director. And